This pumpkin bread has a crumble topping that looks like a mass grave. How festive! Let's watch.
Let's see what's cooking. It's time for Yo-Yo Max 12.
Hello everyone, starting off with the crumble topping that we're going to make the little skulls with. That's 1 cup of all-purpose flour, half a cup of brown sugar, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, and stir those things together. You just want to make sure there's no big lumps of brown sugar in the mixture. And then add 1/2 cup of butter that's at room temperature. And then you're just going to work that butter into the flour and brown sugar mixture. You want to get something that's fairly uniform, and it's going to be on the crumbly side. Now I'm taking portions of this and I'm pressing it into a mold that I have. And in particular, I wanted little skulls. And as you can see, just push it in there until all the little cavities of the mold are filled. And I did a bunch of different sizes. I also did some bones, some rib cages, and that kind of thing with this crumble topping. And I did a whole bunch of little tiny ones. Then I put them in the freezer, and I just put them in there for about half an hour until when you touch them, they're very, very firm to the touch. And then they popped out of the mold quite nicely, and even easier with a silicone mold because you can push on them because it's flexible. Keep these refrigerated until they're time to use them. Now for the pumpkin bread. This is a very standard pumpkin bread recipe. Starts off with 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, a teaspoon of baking soda, 1/4 teaspoon of baking powder, and a teaspoon of salt. You stir those things together, and in another bowl, a larger one, you place 1 can of canned pumpkin, 2 eggs, 1/3 cup of oil, a teaspoon of vanilla extract, and a cup of sugar, and then blend that together. Make sure you're using pumpkin puree, not pumpkin pie filling. Then add the dry ingredients and start to blend. And as I'm blending, I'm going, you know what, I've made pumpkin bread before and I don't remember it being this orange when I was blending it. And then I realized I forgot the spices. So I'm adding them now. 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of ground cloves, and a 1/4 teaspoon of ginger. And then I continued to beat this until it was nice and smooth, and then the color looked like it was supposed to look like. Okay, so blend this well, and then once your batter is ready, you're going to pour it into a loaf pan. Mine's been greased with cooking spray. You could also put this in a cake pan as well, like an 8x8 or an 8x10 inch baking dish if you want. Spread the top out, and now it's time to add the streusel or the crumble topping. Now, first thing I did was add just some of the plain crumble topping that hasn't been formed into any shapes. And then I started to add the skulls. Now, hindsight is always 20/20, so I'm going to tell you what you should probably try to do here. Now, as things bake, especially in this kind of loaf pan, the edges are going to cook first, the center will cook last, and as the center is cooking, it'll rise up to make a domed shape that you usually see in some kind of baked loaf. So when you put your skulls on, don't put them all on, put about half of them on, let's say, and put most of them around the edges, and don't put very many in the center. And as you can see here, these are some of the skeleton pieces that I made. You can actually make some fairly fine details with this streusel. So I probably put way too many skulls in the center of this pan. Now what you're going to do is take this and you're going to bake it at 350 degrees for about 30 minutes. Now that's not nearly long enough to cook it all, but we have to add more skulls. So here it is after about 35 or so minutes. And as you can see, a lot of the skulls, especially in the center, are lost because it's kind of gets squished, and their shape is not as defined. They've expanded a little bit. So I added more skulls, a couple more to the edges. I put a couple more in the center, and then I continue to bake this for an additional about 25 to 30 minutes until a toothpick inserted in the center comes out clean. And this is the end result. Now, if you make if you add your skulls as it's baking, so just put a few, bake it, and as it's baking and you can see how it's rising, you can add more, and then towards the end you'll have this lovely mound and you'll have a bunch of great skulls. Now I'm not going to call this a fail because I really do think that it turned out well. You can see some of the skulls and it really does look like a mass grave burial ground. Here's a cross section after I cut into it. The actual pumpkin bread itself is very nice. It has a really great pumpkin spice flavor, as you can imagine, with all of those spices that I did eventually add to this. It's a good recipe, and the addition of the streusel topping adds a little bit of crunch and extra sweetness to it, and it's very, very nice pumpkin bread recipe. Here it is as a slice. Now the effect of the skulls is kind of lost at this point because you're cutting into them and you're only getting a slice. But if you make this for a Halloween party as a dessert, then put the whole loaf on the table so people can see what it looks like before you slice it up, so they get the full effect. Now when I was done the pumpkin bread, I realized that I still had some pumpkin left in the can. So I looked for a recipe that used a small amount of pumpkin, and I found this particular recipe that makes pumpkin pie tarts. And if I made half of a recipe, I used up exactly what I had left, 3/4 of a cup of pumpkin. So it worked out perfectly. So I decided to whip this together, a half batch of these pumpkin pie tarts, to use up the last of that pumpkin. And if you're interested in the recipe, I'll put a link in the description box below. It's basically your classic pumpkin pie is what it is, except you put it into little tarts. And I ended up having enough filling for 7 of them. Now what I did is I took these, I put them in the oven until the filling wasn't liquidy, but it was still pretty runny in the middle. And then I added my little streusel skulls on there. I was hoping that they would stay on the surface and they wouldn't drop down to the bottom of the little tartlet. And that's exactly what they did. I put them back in the oven until the filling was set and completely done to my liking. And this is how they turned out. They did expand a tiny little bit, so they lost a little bit of their features, but overall, actually, they were quite nice, and I think these look really, really cute. And if you're having a Halloween party, these are the perfect sized dessert if you're going to put these on a table. And that streusel topping adds a lot of flavor, especially for people that are a huge fan of pumpkin pie to begin with. On your screen right now are 2 playlists. One is for my Halloween treats and the other is for my pumpkin playlist. It's a whole bunch of things that I've made with pumpkin, and they're not all dessert. Thank you so much for watching.